Spotify's Discovery Dashboard is a super powerful tool for us as podcast creators to help us diagnose what some of the issues might be that are keeping us from greater discoverability. This is one of those things that we as podcast creators have basically had to guess at and try and figure out on our own for basically the history of podcasting, and Spotify has pretty much gone and solved that for us. Well, almost. See, while Spotify's dashboard allows us to benchmark against ourselves, so we can measure what our conversion rates are today and then look to improve those from week to week and month to month and year to year, it doesn't really give us any sense of how we're doing compared to other shows. And this is a bit of a problem, because if we know that our conversion rates are way better than the typical show, then we don't really have anything to worry about. We can pat ourselves on the back and keep doing what we're doing. Whereas if our conversion rates are much lower than the typical show, then this should be a red flag to us that we probably want to know about, that we need to do something about the way our show is being presented to potential listeners. But Spotify doesn't give us any way to do this. So I decided to do something about it myself. We're going to get to that in a minute, but first let's look at what Spotify has already given us. So to start off, we can access the Spotify Discovery Dashboard by heading to podcasters.spotify.com and logging into our dashboard. Now, we're going to want to make sure we select the right show that we're looking for. So I'm going to look for Podcast Marketing Trends Explained here, my current show. And then we're going to head over to the Analytics tab. Once we're in the Analytics tab, we can head over to Discovery, and we're going to see the funnel that Spotify presents us here. On this page, we can see how many people our show has reached over the past 30 days. And so we can see my show right now is in between seasons, so it's not getting a ton of promotion. And so we can see the show has been presented to 331 people over the last 30 days. In the middle, we can see the number of people who showed interest in our show. And so if we read the little blurb here, which Spotify is going to make sure that you see no matter where you hover on this section, we can see that this is the number of distinct people who have gone to the podcast page or episode page, added the episodes to playlists, followed the podcast, or played any episode on Spotify for 0 seconds or more. And so here then we can see a conversion rate, 7.9%, out of this 331 people, 26 of those engaged with the show in some semi-meaningful way. And then finally, we have over on the far right, the number of people who streamed. And so in Spotify, this essentially means the number of people who played an episode for 60 seconds or more. So they are what Spotify deems engaged listeners to at least some extent. And then we can see that there is a conversion rate here. In my case, it is 73.1%. And so that is the number of people who showed interest, who then went on to stream for more than 60 seconds. And so here we have total number of people who have seen the show in the last 30 days, number of people who have showed interest in the last 30 days, and then the number of people who have streamed the show in the last 30 days. And so this is the information that Spotify gives us. It gives us these benchmarks, 7.9% for me on the awareness to interest conversion rate. And then we've got from the interest to stream conversion rate, 73.1%. And so you might be thinking, okay, that's great, but what do these numbers actually mean? And this is exactly the problem with what Spotify has given us. Like I mentioned before, we can use these numbers to track. I can look at, 1 month from now, have I gone up or down from 7.9% conversion rate from awareness to interest? And then have I gone up from the interest to streaming rate of 73.1? And I might make some changes to try and influence those numbers and those conversion rates to get more people who are shown the show to show interest in it and then ultimately stream it. And so we're going to look at what some of those changes might be coming up. But again, this doesn't really tell us, is this good or is this bad? So I decided to aggregate a bunch of podcasters' data to actually get a better sense of how each of us are doing and what we can do to improve. After Spotify rolled out this dashboard, I decided to reach out to a bunch of podcasters on my email list and personal network to try and aggregate as much data as I could to help us get a better understanding of what some of the broader benchmarks are for both this awareness to interest conversion rate as well as the interest to streaming conversion rate. And I put together this page to help share that data publicly. On this page, you can see the up-to-date current benchmarks for awareness to interest conversion rate and interest to stream conversion rate. If you're interested in submitting your own data, you can do that right here by filling out a super short survey with just 2 questions. One where you can upload a screenshot of your Spotify dashboard, and a second one where you can share a link to your Spotify show listing, which will only be seen by me so that I can do a further, deeper show analysis and look for trends between cover arts and titles and conversion rates. Now, back to the big question that's probably on your mind. What do I actually do with this data even once we have the benchmarks? So here's the thing. Each of these benchmarks points to a set of potential problems that may be holding your show back from more discoverability and thus growth. And in general, these problems that are hurting and suppressing your conversion rates are related to your show's packaging. Now, your show packaging is made up of a number of listener touch points. Essentially, these are the things that a listener is going to come into contact with before ever listening to a second of audio from your show, and perhaps before even clicking into your show listing. So the external packaging touch points are going to be most prominently your show title and cover art. And then once we click into your show listing, we've got a series of internal packaging touch points, which are going to include your show description as well as your episode titles, along with a series of other touch points that are going to be a little bit more minor. So what do our conversion rates tell us about potential problems with our show packaging, and what do we do about it once we know where the issues are? Let's break down each of the conversion rates one at a time and point to some of the issues that a lower than average conversion rate might point to. Let's start off by looking at a lower than average awareness to interest conversion rate. So essentially what's happening here is that people are seeing your show in Spotify, whether it's an algorithmic recommendation on their For You page, or it's coming up in search results for a podcast, or it might be recommended after a previous podcast episode that they listened to. Regardless of where they're coming across it, people are being shown your podcast. And if you have a low awareness to interest conversion rate, this means that after they see it, they're not clicking through and taking a follow-up action. So what does this mean? Chances are it's one of the following issues. The first is that the cover art and or title, or the combination of both of those, doesn't clearly communicate what the show is about. So somebody's coming across the show, maybe they actually would be an ideal listener for the show, but they can't tell that, so they're not clicking into it. The second issue might be that the cover art doesn't look legitimate. And so essentially, this means that the cover art does not convey to the listener that this is going to be worth their time. This is often the result of amateurish cover art that doesn't quite feel like a lot of care or craft has gone into it, even though the show itself may possess a high degree of care and craft. And so there's a disconnect between the external packaging and the internal product. And if people don't immediately feel like the show is going to be worth their time when they're looking at just the cover art and title, chances are they're passing it by in favor of another show that does. In addition to a lack of either clarity or legitimacy, it could be that your show exists in a competitive space and your show concept itself lacks a distinctive hook. And so there might be a number of shows all on the same topic, and they all tend to seem kind of the same. And if your show doesn't possess a clear differentiating hook of some kind that is communicated or hinted at through the cover art and title, chances are you're going to get fewer people clicking through. That said, if your show exists in a highly competitive space with a lot of shows, even if your show does have a compelling hook, your conversion rate is always going to be lower than shows that exist in less competitive spaces, even if those shows aren't as highly differentiated themselves. One final reason that your show may have a lower than average awareness to interest conversion rate is that your show is an ultra niche topic within a larger, more popular space. And so people are searching for the broad topic coming across your show, but your show is always only going to be of interest to a narrow number of people. And so that's fine. This isn't necessarily something to worry about in that case, but it is a reason why you might have a low conversion rate. Essentially, lots of people are seeing the show, but only a handful of those is it actually relevant to. So these are some of the most common reasons why you might have a lower than average awareness to conversion rate. But what if you have a lower than average interest to stream rate? If this is the case, it means that people are clicking into your show listing, but they aren't going on to listen to the first 60 seconds of any one episode. Now, it could also mean that they're not clicking play on any episodes whatsoever. So what might be going on here? The first reason is that after clicking in, they realize that the show isn't actually what they were looking for. And this could be because the show description doesn't align with what the show packaging seemed to suggest, or it could be that the episode titles don't align with what the show packaging seemed to suggest or allude to. Sometimes this might mean that the episode topics and titles are just a bit of a different take than what the listener was looking for, or other times it could mean that the external show packaging is entirely misaligned from what the show is actually about. And so listeners think they're getting one thing coming in, and it turns out that the show has nothing to do with what the external packaging suggested. Now, another reason could be that your show actually is aligned with the external show packaging, but the episode titles just don't grab listeners. And so they click into the show and they start scanning the titles and nothing really seems to grab them. And so they click out and click back into another show in order to look for something that does. Finally, it could be the case that people are clicking into your show, actually clicking play on an episode, but they're not listening to the full 60 seconds in order for Spotify to register it as a stream. And so if this is the case, the reason is most likely that they're not having a great first listener experience. And so they click play and there's some issue with the audio quality or the presentation of the content that leads them to exit out of the episode before they reach that threshold. So I want to move on to diagnosing some more specific scenarios. But first, let's do a quick recap. With the awareness to interest conversion rate, essentially what we're looking at is how many people who see the show go on to click into it. And so essentially what's at play here is the external packaging, the cover art and the show title that people are presented with. That is ultimately the thing that's going to get them to take action. The second conversion rate is the interest to stream conversion rate. And essentially what this is measuring is how many people, once they click into a show listing, go on to click play on an episode and stream it for the first full 60 seconds. And so essentially what we're looking at here is the internal packaging, show description, episode titles, as well as the first 60 seconds of your episodes. Now, let's move on to diagnosing some more specific scenarios where maybe you have one conversion rate that's high and the other that's low, and look at what this might indicate about your show. To help us diagnose what some of the issues might be, I've set up a simple 2x2 matrix with the interest to stream conversion rate on the x-axis. So we've got low interest to stream conversion rate on the left and high interest to stream conversion rate on the right, as well as the awareness to interest conversion rate on the y-axis. And so we've got high awareness to interest conversion rate on the top and low awareness to interest conversion rate on the bottom. And so as we can see here, there are 4 common scenarios that a show might fall into. Let's start off with low conversion rates on both sides. And so we have very few people clicking in who see the show in the first place. And then of those who do click into the show, very few of those are ultimately clicking play on an episode and listening for 60 seconds. So when we think about this scenario here, what some of the common issues might be, essentially this is pointing to problems with both the external and internal show packaging. And so this is going to likely be a lack of clarity and or legitimacy. And so that lack of clarity and legitimacy, the problems with the external packaging is keeping people from clicking in the first place. That could also be due to a lack of differentiation and or a strong hook, especially if you're in a competitive space. It could also hint at expectation misalignment, poor listener experience, or as well an inconsistent publishing schedule. And so one of the things that may happen when people click into a show, it might be aligned with what they're looking for, but they see that episodes haven't been published in 2 years, or maybe there's only been one episode published in the last 3 months, and they're really looking for something that is up to date and current, and so they don't click in. And so essentially, if you have a low conversion rate on both sides, there are a number of things that need to be tightened up here. A lot of issues that are both keeping people from clicking into your show in the first place in terms of external packaging, as well as maybe expectation misalignment or poor show quality in the first 60 seconds or poor episode titling as well that is keeping them from clicking in. So this is pretty obvious based on what we've already gone through so far, what some of those issues might be. Now, let's look at some of the more nuanced situations that you might find yourself in here. So let's say that you have a high awareness to interest conversion rate, but a low interest to stream conversion rate. And so in other words, you're getting people to click into your show from the main kind of Spotify page, wherever they saw it in the first place, but they're not going on to listen for 60 seconds. So some of the issues here might be expectation misalignment. And so we talked about this already, where they click in thinking that they're going to get one thing. And once they're inside the show listing, they realize that either it doesn't look as good as they thought it was going to be based on the external packaging, or it doesn't seem aligned whatsoever. It could also be that they click in and they actually click play on the episode, but in the first 60 seconds, there's some issues with the audio quality, or they're just not hooked or grabbed. And so they exit out to go look for something else. And once again, it could be the inactive show or inconsistent publish schedule that is keeping them, once they've clicked in, from moving on. So for the next more nuanced scenario, let's look at having a high interest to stream conversion rate, but a low awareness to interest conversion rate. And so here, essentially what we have is there are very few people clicking into the show from the outside, but once they click in, a high number of those people, perhaps even higher than average, are ultimately going on to listen to the episode for 60 seconds. So in this case, we probably have problems with external packaging. And so the show might be great on the inside. Once people get in, we can see that there are high quality episode titles that are pulling them in. Maybe we've got a great teaser episode that draws people in, but from the outside, that is not being communicated. And so again, this could be lack of clarity or legitimacy and or poor communication of the show's appeal. It could also be that there's a lack of differentiation and or a hook from the outside. Once again, even if your show actually does have that internally, it's not being communicated through the title and cover art. And it could also be, once again, a super niche topic within a highly trafficked niche, where there's getting a lot of exposure, but it's just there's only a small percentage of those people within the larger niche or industry who are interested in your very narrow topic. And so again, this would lead to a lot of people seeing the show, very few people clicking through, but those people who are clicking through know that this is for them. And so you might have a very high conversion rate on the interest to stream side of things. Finally, that brings us to the final scenario, which is a high awareness to interest conversion rate and a high interest to stream conversion rate. And so essentially what we have here is that you're doing everything right. And so you have clear, legitimate, attractive packaging. You have a compelling show hook. You have clear alignment between the external and internal packaging, and you have a great first listener experience. And so essentially people are seeing your show, they're noticing it, they're being attracted to it, they're clicking in, they're finding what they're looking for, they're going on to click play, and ultimately they're enjoying what they're hearing. And so this is essentially the ideal listener acquisition process that we want to emulate for everyone. Speaking of which, now that we know what some of these issues might be, how do we go about systematically improving our show's packaging in order to reach that ideal listener acquisition first experience? If we head back to the benchmarks page here and scroll down, I've actually included a number of resources to help with just this problem. If we look at this section here, I've included a number of blog posts and in-depth guides related to improving various aspects of your show packaging, from episode titles and show titles to artwork and more. And if we keep scrolling down, I've included some episodes of the YouTube show that I do with Justin Jackson from transistor.fm, where in every episode, we pull up one of our listeners' show listings and step-by-step break down and critique their show packaging, giving them pointers on how they can improve it and how you can as well. Lastly, if you haven't already, one of the best things you can do is contribute your own Spotify data to help us build out these benchmarks further and improve their accuracy. You have the option to make your data entirely anonymous, although if you do choose to submit your Spotify show listing, it will help me do some deeper digging and identify more of the relationship between show packaging and discoverability in Spotify. The results of which I'll be sharing publicly in the hopes of helping all of us improve our discoverability on the platform. So I hope you found this helpful, and I hope you'll let me know where your show stands on each of the conversion rates, and if you're below average in either of the conversion rates, what you think some of the issues might be and what you're going to be working on to solve them. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll talk to you more real soon.